This is the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Monument on Riverside Drive on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It was dedicated in 1902 on Memorial Day in a ceremony led by President Theodore Roosevelt. In an essay entitled The Utility and Liability of History, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche distinguishes between three kinds of history: antiquarian, monumental, and critical. In the case of antiquarian history, the artifacts of the past are examined without regard to any pre-existing system of value. Monumental history, on the other hand, raises up certain figures or events of the past as ideals that can offer support in the present for sustaining efforts that might otherwise appear impossible. Regarding the third mode of history, critical history, Nietzsche writes that the human being must, quote, from time to time employ the strength to shatter and dissolve the past. He accomplishes this by bringing this past before a tribunal, painstakingly interrogating it and finally condemning it. The Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Monument was built as part of the City Beautiful movement that took hold in major cities in the United States at the end of the 19th century. The movement proposed to stimulate progressive social reform by way of beautiful monuments that would inspire moral and civic virtue among urban populations, especially in the case of New York, among newly arrived immigrants living in the tenements. The portion of history of New York City that comes to my mind as obscured by this monument is the draft riots of 1863 that began in Midtown. Working-class white immigrants savagely beat and in some cases killed, tortured, lynched, their bodies mutilated, black men and women and abolitionists, both black and white. More than any other city in the North, New York City's financial elite had been enriched through the slave trade. Anti-war newspapers for months had been proclaiming that the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Lincoln on New Year's Day that same year would result in a flood of newly freed blacks coming north to take the jobs of white immigrants. The importance of forgetting, Nietzsche argues, is as an antidote to the inertia that can come from too much history. On the other hand, he continues, quote, at times this very life that requires forgetfulness demands the temporary suspension of this forgetfulness. This is when it is supposed to become absolutely clear precisely how unjust the existence of certain things, for example, a privilege, a caste, or a dynasty really is, and how much these things deserve to be destroyed. On the same day in 1863 as the last day of the draft riots, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the first all-black regiment of the Union Army, led the attack by Union soldiers to capture Fort Wagner. Among the many dead of the regiment that day was its white commanding officer, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. His parents were part of a prominent Boston family. Both mother and father were Unitarian ministers, abolitionists, and anti-imperialists. On Memorial Day in 2020, police in Minnesota killed George Floyd, and even closer, a liberal white woman in New York City was caught on video making an implicit threat of violence against a black man that implicated her presumption of the racism of the police force when she makes a 911 call. Like the other modes of history, Nietzsche tells us critical history brings with it a corresponding mode of blindness. Quote, for since we are, after all, the products of earlier generations, writes Nietzsche, we are also the products of their aberrations, passions, and errors, indeed of their crimes. It is impossible to free ourselves completely from this chain. One enduring articulation of this chain of history of which Nietzsche speaks is the Black Jacobins, A History of the Haitian Revolution of 1804. The Black Jacobins was written by C.L.R James, the West Indian writer, political activist, and socialist who remains one of the most important black intellectuals at the end of the 20th century. The Haitian revolutionaries, he argues, took from France the principle of universal emancipation and developed it beyond the aporia that it had reached in France due to French economic interests that profited from the slave trade. Another occasion when, I would argue, C.L.R James illuminates the historical chain of which Nietzsche speaks is in an address he gives in London on Black Power in 1967. James argues that Black Power is not a slogan, but a banner, and claims as one of its most crucial precursors the opening of the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. C.L.R James writes, quote, "Self-evident. Jefferson had a nerve. Nothing like this was self-evident anywhere. To this day, there are vast numbers of people who don't believe it. Nevertheless, it is one of the greatest political statements ever made. It is a banner by which and under which tremendous struggles have been waged for liberty, for democracy, for democratic freedom. I hope that you are following me in my view that it is only by placing it historically that we can begin to see what Black Power signifies and avoid gross and dangerous blunders." End quote. Today, we are living in a transition to a long overdue period of critical history. Those who take up this challenge will benefit from having an ear open to the complexity to which the writings of both Friedrich Nietzsche and C.L.R James attest.